welcoming our guest speaker for this morning, Mr. Trevor Manuel.
Thank you very much, Cara Joy. Good morning to all of you. Thank you for the invitation to be here with you today. Manglan freaks me out. He asks me to talk about this life as an engineer. The problem I have is that I don't recall it. I hung up my work boots from civils in 1981. I don't imagine many of your student chapter were around then. So if you say to a young civil engineer, sorry, there wasn't CAD when I was around. We learned we had to draw with Indian ink and Rotring pens. And if you say computers, no, they weren't around. I mean, there was the introduction, and there was little Hewlett-Packard 33E that we used to do triangulations and stuff. That came later because we started life with slide rules and tables. They say, where do you come from? But I think that's the interesting challenge of a profession like civil engineering. It's old. I mean, the best stories are still the stories of the Roman Empire, of the ability to provide water, reticulated, the aqueducts, the roads and bridges. It's an old profession. It's gone through a number of transitions. You read up on the system of roads in South Africa, and you consider for a moment the way in which the passes were built from Cape Town to Johannesburg. And the fascinating story is that they didn't have much heavy earth-moving equipment, and so there are these great stories of how under overhanging rocks on what is the Bainscliff Pass today, once it had been identified that the pass would be taken through there, fires were made, the rock heated and then cooled with water so that it could chip off and then broken up to produce the road surface. It's a fascinating industry that has gone through a number of changes and will continue to be at the leading edge of change, because it's a profession very much involved with the provision of a good quality of life for people. But part of the challenge in a country like South Africa, part of your challenge, or one that you will lead, is how we construct an era of engineering. You know, in the period to the collapse of Lehman Brothers just under a decade ago, there was a period of high finance. And that high finance produced particular outcomes. Part of what it did was to rob a profession like all of the engineering professions of skill sets, because if you had math and applied math and you could model, you'd find your way into the trading floor of some or other financial company, write a big check for yourself. But other professions were denuded of the quantitative skills. But it was also a period of great excess. And so all that remains of it are the stories of Bernie Madoff and the Wolf of Wall Street and those kinds of issues. It was a period of great excess. But that excess didn't translate into the kinds of things that engineers are focused on, relating to matters of the quality of life. And so all of the issues that are so fundamentally important, that remain today as large gaps, are related to engineering deficiencies. Not all of them. No, some of them are medical, A heck of a lot of them are governance. But so much of what the world needs right now is an approach to engineering and a new approach to engineering. We sit here in Johannesburg, we take account of the built environment, we take account, Babalwa, of the fact that Soweto is still Soweto, far away, just like Lens on the other side is far away, and Eldos is out there. All of the vestiges of the Group Areas Act are very much still in our built environment. As an engineering solution, transport engineering hasn't found its proper place. And so poor people still spend a much larger proportion of their incomes on transport. And it's not safe and it's not efficient, and people are affected by all manner of issues in transport. The United States has a president who does not believe in climate change, and in spite of the fact that you've had these a series of very significant hurricanes, Harvey, Irma, Maria, that devastated large parts of the country, and bear in mind that Puerto Rico is part of the United States. He doesn't know it, don't tell him that. And then no sooner had the hurricanes hit, and you had those massive wildfires that has wiped out the California wine country. So for those of you who have an interest in this matter, stock up on Chardonnay. But in spite of all of that, he would say that climate change is a myth. But climate change is real, and it's impacting very directly on the lives of all of us, and will do so increasingly. But as we live, and as we live in concentrated environments, all 7 billion or thereabouts of us, we consume enormous amounts of water, and we produce huge amounts of waste. But these are issues that truly can only be solved by engineers. So how we go about them becomes important. Yesterday in Delhi, capital of India, the percolate levels in the atmosphere were so high that to shut down Delhi, it may remain shut for the next few days. This was a problem that seemed to be of Beijing. A few years ago, India took a decision that the only taxis that they would allow would be taxis and rickshaws, as they call their tuk-tuks, that have significantly reduced or increased emission standards, because they used to run these rickshaws with two-stroke engines that produced, the most awful emissions. And in spite of having taken big decisions a few years ago, the issues are back and people can't breathe. And so it starts out as an engineering problem and very rapidly becomes a health problem. And so when you take account, if you just sit down and plot some of the challenges, we were talking about systems thinking. Now, if you take account of the many challenges that present, and you say to a grouping like yourselves, a grouping of civil engineers, where could you apply your skills across this very wide panorama of needs right now? I'm sure that we could walk behind you with a mop to just mop up the drool, because there's so much that can excite engineers about the opportunities that present. Bear in mind that in the main, governments don't start out with solutions. I know I spent 20 years of my life in government. They don't start out with the solutions. Somewhere the solutions must come from other parts of society. Now, if we just looked at the engineering issues around the world now, let's start in the West. Let's start in the United States. There actually isn't a heck of a lot going on in the broad arena of civil engineering. It's a deep tragedy because the US used to have, certainly in the wake of World War II, had the biggest investments as part of the New Deal. In fact, that was between the wars and continued with a big program of significant infrastructure. But all of that infrastructure has fallen into very deep decline. And you look at the nature of the challenge now, you look at basic issues like the ability for people living in New Jersey to get into New York, across or under the Hudson River, and there's a big problem because it has been neglected for so long. You look at the state of highways, at least once a year now, one of the big bridges collapses because it's way past its life cycle. There are some exciting things. There is the California high-speed rail that'll link LA to San Francisco, but it'll only be commissioned in 2029. It's a big project, but it'll only be commissioned in 2029. There isn't much else happening. I'm saying so what used to be the world's largest economy still is nominally, has actually fallen behind in a whole range of issues. No, let me not say this, there's very little else. There's a chap they stole from Pretoria, his name is Elon Musk. Was doing amazing things apart from his ability to now run the SpaceX program to resurface the space shuttles. What he's been able to do with the Tesla car is quite phenomenal. That speaks to a new generation. And I think as electric cars take off, what happens upstream from that, again, engineered solutions becomes important. But the other big issue I think that he will harvest from that is energy storage. Because already the efficiencies from the Tesla battery project are significant, but it's not only going to be for autos. Because if the same processes can be used to save or to store energy from renewables, and whether this be wind, solar, or hydro, it begins to change the entire geography and space of energy production in the world. And I think that's very exciting, maybe prototype stage, but it's very exciting. The key challenge, I think, is, and arising from the United States, is that they've not thought through how to finance the big projects. Is it city, state, or federal? And for as long as these battles continue, the engineering remains undone. So let's move from there, and we can continue going westward and arrive at China, where perhaps because they have a command, the Politburo of the Communist Party consists of 6 people, and in two Politburos ago, all 6 members were PhD engineers. I think it gave the developments in China a massive head start because there was so much maths in the room. But let's just look at a few indicators from China. Between 2009 and 2013, there were 87 new metro rail systems, mass rapid rail systems built in China, adding 3,100 kilometers of metro rail to the entire geography. And you can imagine what that does for people in cities. The difference between doing underground rail and trying to do what Joburg and Cape Town and Tshwane and have done with the bus rapid transport is that you don't have to retrofit onto roads that are already bad. You go under. And China's rail systems are nothing short of miraculous. A few weeks ago, they launched their first unmanned aerial vehicle, cargo plane, with a payload of 1.5 tons. Now, I mean, this stuff boggles the mind. I know I can see from the smiles who plays with their drones over weekends. And you think of a drone that is almost 3 tons heavy and has an additional payload of 1.3 tons, and then you begin to think how the world changes. You also have to look at the fact that in China they've built, successfully launched into a joint Russian-Sino project to do a plane about the size of the Boeing 737 or the Airbus 320, successfully flying around the place. They've got an order for 220 planes. So for the first time, because of the dominance of Boeing and Airbus, there's an alternative that's arising, and the investment that this project is putting into a wide-bodied, long-haul flight that may come on stream in about 2023 it also speaks volumes, because this is an area where there's been significant change. You can see what's happened to the Airbus 380 and the Boeing Dreamliner, and suddenly there's going to be something that's very different. And of course, the Dreamliner is different because it's made completely of composite materials rather than the old school aluminium. So the Chinese are right up there, and of course, if you look at the fact that they now have the fastest rail in the world. They built, and it's a crazy thing from an engineering perspective, but they've built the system that they launched a few months ago called Fuxing, that takes trains up to speeds of 350 kilometers an hour, bullet trains. And it's designed to run from Shanghai to Beijing. They've learned 6 years ago they had a major problem with their high-speed rail. They fixed all of those things. And now they're out there, and the engineers are saying, well, this is a very difficult problem, because if you want to construct rail that can take a train at 350 k's, you have to spend 90% more than on the rail that takes a train up to 250 kilometers an hour. But they've done all of it. I mean, they've got maglev out of Shanghai airport. It's a phenomenal story. So they're out there and they want to prove that engineering is not a thing of the past. It's a thing of the future, about the future. And I think given population sizes and given the nature of the issues they have to deal with, including housing, roads, and so on. There were also some crazy schemes that didn't get off the ground. There was this straddle bus that that was just going to sit across the road and go over cars, and it wouldn't get in the way of cars. It was a bit of a story, but there's the one problem that they're battling to solve. And that is the problem of water. Now, the interesting thing about China is, being an old society, as old as it is, you've got to pause and say, they've done some fascinating things before. When they built the Great Wall, over its life they employed 1 million men. not people. There weren't women involved in the project there. 1 million men on the construction of the Great Wall. They had to build forests to provide the timber. They had to construct large areas of deforested area to produce the food for the 1 million men. They've done major things before, and they've now drawn upon themselves and take these same issues forward. And even when Mao Zedong was General Secretary of the Communist Party, he had this idea of rerouting the rivers, because the rivers all run east, and so you need a different distribution. But they haven't been successful. They haven't been successful, and where the rivers flow, the water is so badly degraded by years of chemical interventions that China has a problem, just like India has a problem. And India's great problem is the levels of arsenic now in groundwater. And the United States has an interesting and different kind of problem. You may recall a place called Lake Flint, where none of the water in Lake Flint is drinkable, and there were major health problems there 2 years ago. Now and that's because of the levels of mercury in the water. And now it appears that studies have shown that apart from Lake Flint, there are 32 other cities that have comparably high mercury levels in the water. So how will we solve the problem? A few years ago, I met a rather interesting engineer. There are some interesting engineers. And this a gentleman who is kind of on in years now was the chief water engineer in Singapore. And at that stage, Singapore got all its water from Malaysia. The pipeline ran next to the causeway, and that was the sole source of water. And Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister, called him in and said, we've got to solve the problem. We can't depend on Malaysia, because there'd also been a bit of a war between the two. And so Singapore declared independence, and now they couldn't depend on Malaysia to be the sole supplier of water. And then they looked at a number of options. And of course they looked at reverse osmosis desalination. They looked at what was available in aquifers. They looked at a range of options, including a little bit that they would keep in reserve coming across the causeway. And they decided, this man led the process. They decided on blended water. Now, people have an aversion to some parts. People don't like drinking recycled water. You hear these stories where they have recycled water, like in Windhoek. They say, here's a glass of water and a toothpick. People don't like dealing with these kinds of issues. And so what they did in Singapore was, their national day is on the 9th of August. And the Prime Minister and Cabinet were all sitting there. And they all had bottles of water labeled Singapore New Water. And Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew took a toast of water, straight from the bottle, and all of his cabinet did. And suddenly the taboo of this blended water was gone, and Singaporeans drink Singapore New Water to this day still. Civil engineering is about solving problems that present in everyday life, and I think the biggest of those in the world still is water. Now, apart from water, there are a number of other issues that I think we need to get our heads into. Oh, and here in Gauteng, I mean, people may feel relaxed because it's rained again after the drought of last year. But you know, I cannot for the life of me conceive of why we haven't been smarter about filtering acid mine drainage. There's a large source of water. I know that an engineering firm did it in the coal mining areas. They gave me the water. I was a bit queasy about it, but I drank it and I'm still here. It's about finding solutions like that I think will bring engineering back into fashion. But I think that the biggest remains what we do with space, what we do to provide people with access to a decent standard of living. And it's a combination of access to housing, the general reticulated, connected services, that would include roads, energy, water, sanitation. The ability to re-engage, because we can't keep building further, you know. If we build further south beyond Orange Farm from here, we're going to be in the Free State. It's about reconfiguring the way in which we live, the way in which we interact, and understand that it's not just about concrete blocks. It's about doing a series of other things with the planners to make a difference. Mexico City has a density of 5,950 people per square kilometer. New York has 9,600. Mumbai has 32,814. The Western Cape has 1,293. It's a very interesting metric for Cape Town, actually. 1,293, because that's an aggregated number of the vast density of the Cape Flats and the exceedingly sparsely populated parts where the trees grow. These are the interesting challenges that present, and I think part of reconfiguring how we live, how we interact, and how we reconstruct communities is a very important challenge for engineers. And then there's the landfill issues. It's becoming a bigger and bigger problem. I mean, there are so many landfill sites around Johannesburg and Tshwane where there are huge problems. There's seepage, there's smell, there's the inability to manage what goes into landfill, and there is the fact that we are quite a non-compliant society. I live in Johannesburg and I plead with people in the city to help us recycle differently, and the only thing you get is a bright green bag to put your paper in. Everything else goes together, and we must be the last country in the world that treats our refuse in quite this way. I saw, apropos of nothing, I saw a TV program the other day on Chile where they harvest all manner of plastics, and the plastics are produced into bricks, and there's a magnificently large housing program built with these plastic bricks now. So they bring together the plastic, extrude them, and they've got this amazing new method. I mean, all bricks have to be made from concrete or clay? It's an interesting question, but there you go. But I think that overlaying many of these kinds of challenges is a governance issue. When the presentations were made on the Gauteng Freeway Improvement Project, on the one hand, some of my DNA was very excited, and truly, I mean, some of the changes that were brought with the GFIP are fantastic. I mean, you look at the R21 today and you look at what it was a decade ago, it's quite inconceivable that the change has been that rapid. But the Department of Transport had copied the idea of the gantries and e-tolls. My concern then and my concern now is that it's a compliance issue. I mean, all of China, the United States, many cities in Europe have exactly the same gantry system. But we feel that it's an imposition on what we want to be, yet we fail to engage with reality that the future would be a non-car future. And so people who want to travel in cars must be made to pay. It's a compliance issue, it's a governance issue. And because governments are not prepared to deal with these big challenges, you sometimes get the outcomes that you have. So you can't have user pay systems go anywhere. Let me conclude by some of the ongoing challenges, and one of them is to draw on a word that you used, ma'am. It's a bad word that starts with the letter C. Corruption. I mean, you look at a country like Brazil, and you look at how it's come apart. And the way in which it's come apart is largely because of the car wash system that was run through engineering programs. Corruption. The presence of the Cosa Nostra in construction programs over a century at least, well, they had a head start because of the Romans having been so good at water reticulation in roads, but they understood it a bit better than the rest of us. But unless we deal with this issue, we will not be able to provide the kinds of engineering services that we ought to provide to people. And whereas it was for engineers to know the maths, applied maths, and so on, I think increasingly ethics will become a more important part of the training of engineers going forward. You can't outsource those kinds of things. In many parts, engineering will remain. The Hooke's law of solid mechanics has been around since 1676. The formulae for bending moments and applied thermodynamics have been around forever. The methods of calculating the outcomes have changed very significantly, and the methods of recording that. And if you overlay what will become an increasingly important part of engineering going forward, artificial intelligence, then I think we will look at an industry that during our lifetimes will be very radically different from what it is. I mean, you look at change already in our lifetimes. The iPhone 6 has more capacity, more computing capacity than the computer that put Apollo 9 on the moon in 1969. And that computer was virtually the size of the room that we're in. So we'll live through a series of changes in this regard. What's very important is that as a profession, engineering is right at the front end of understanding that whilst computing power will make some things possible, the basics of engineering will remain pretty much there. And the basics of engineering, especially civil engineering, I think is still very much 9.8 meters per second square. You're not going to change that during our lifetimes, but you can change the way in which you calculate it. So I end by saying that I remain an out of practice, frustrated engineer. But I think that if we don't together focus on building an era of engineering and frequently being seen to lead government into what they need to do, we'll continue to look backwards, and life for others will advance, and our own situation in South Africa will kind of view, because you don't remain in the same place. You don't remain in the same place. If you don't build and you don't maintain, then you are regressing, and I think that's a big challenge that confronts us. So make your voices heard as engineers, because that's what society needs. That's what democracy requires of you. That's the best way to apply the skill set that you have. Thank you very much.